Greetings and welcome to the Introduction to Astronomy. In this week's Misconception in Astronomy, we are going to talk about the planets and find out if the planets produce light of their own. So, let's get started here. And do the planets produce their own light? Well, yes and no. Now, what we typically think about is visible light, the light that we see with our eyes. And when we see the planets in the sky, like we see in the image off to the right here, seeing the planets Venus and Mercury higher in the sky and Mars and Jupiter closer to the horizon, then that light is not produced by the planets. That visible light is reflected sunlight. So all we're seeing there is sunlight left the sun, traveled out to the planet, bounced off the planet, and back here to Earth. The same way the moon in this image is shining. It receives light from the sun, which is then reflected to Earth. Now, however, we really have to look at that there are other wavelengths. And to an astronomer, to a scientist, light does not mean just visible light. That is only a small portion of the spectrum. So what we can see when we look at with light here is something like this. And that is where the light occurs. So here we can see the visible band of light, and that's only a small portion of all of the wavelengths. But for an object like the sun, its light would peak at about 6,000 Kelvin, and we can see that curve there labeled as the black body curve at the sun's temperature. So the sun would be giving off a lot of visible light. The Earth, on the other hand, would be closer to the 300 Kelvin temperature, and you can see that does not intersect the visible band at all. So the Earth does not give off any visible light. That would be comparable for any of the other planets as well, because the temperatures are essentially the same. So Earth is not giving off any visible light. It is reflecting sunlight, as are the other planets, but not giving off its own light. So what are we seeing when we look at planets? Well, really, we're seeing the light of the sun reflected off the surface or atmosphere. And what we find is the planets are not near warm enough. If we look at the temperatures here, the Earth would have to be 20 times hotter to be able to produce light like the sun, and would have to be at least 4 or 5 times hotter to even give off a decent amount of visible light. So what do the planets emit? The planets actually emit infrared light, and we can see an image here taken of the planet Mars. So the image on the right is actually a visible light image. That's what we see. That's reflected sunlight. The other images are two of the same image. One is a little masked better, and that brings out a little more detail. And that is looking in the infrared spectrum, in this case at 12.8 microns. So we can then see the planet in the infrared, and that's because the cooler temperatures mean longer wavelength. So in reality, infrared light is just light. It is just another type of light, exactly the same as the visible light that we're used to seeing. It's just that it has a longer wavelength, and it's not one that our eyes are sensitive to. So in that way, yes, planets do produce their own light. However, that is not the case when we actually look at the planets. When we're looking at them in general, we are seeing the planets in visible light, and that is reflected light. Now, here we can see the entire spectrum again, and that is that we're looking at just that small portion. Not only does it include infrared there, but also things like microwaves and radio waves off to the right, and the gamma rays, X-rays, and ultraviolet off to the left. So we get a lot of different types of light, visible being only one portion of those. Now, do we ever get visible light produced by the planets? And yes, they can. And there's very special situations where, like, gases in the atmosphere are excited, giving us things like the aurora that we see, as in the image shown here. And there we can see the aurora. That is actually visible light being produced in the atmosphere of Earth. That is done by particles from the sun striking Earth's atmosphere, but it is actually emitted on Earth, not reflected starlight. So not reflected light from our sun, actually emitted on Earth in our atmosphere. So let's go ahead and finish up with our summary. And what we've looked at today was that planets are really not warm enough to be able to produce their own visible light. They can emit infrared light, and on occasion we can see visible light from things like aurora that are emitted from a planet. So that concludes this week's Misconception in Astronomy on the planets producing their own light. We'll be back again next week for another Misconception in Astronomy. So until then, have a great day, everyone, and I will see you in class.